All right, this is an example of a rock, of the rock that or the mineral, excuse me, that we mine to make our phosphorus fertilizers. We take this particular mineral and we react it with either phosphoric acid that we've made or with sulfuric acid. And between the two of those, then we produce a phosphoric acid from this rock, and we make our phosphorus fertilizers from that. So, okay, this is the phosphorus apatite, which we also refer to rock phosphate. One of the things that with rock phosphate, if you're working with organics, you can use rock phosphate on acid soils, but make for sure that it is very finely ground to like a talcum powder or something like that. If it's very big particle sizes, it's not going to work even in acid soils, but in neutral to calcareous soils, it won't work at all. So just make for sure that you've got acid soils if you're going to use rock phosphate. Next slide. Okay, this is the cycle for phosphorus. It looks a whole lot easier than the nitrogen cycle did, but we know a whole lot more about the nitrogen cycle, especially once it hits the soil, than we do than we have control over, especially the phosphorus cycle. You'll notice that we have an organic source, and this organic source is the plant and animal residues. That organic material goes into the soil, and then it has to go through, you notice that we've got this word mineralization and immobilization there. So most of it, the dominant arrow is going to mineralization, so most of the organic phosphorus will be giving us mineralization to the soil solution for phosphorus. You'll notice that the soil solution is the only arrow that actually goes up to the plant. And so the plant is going to be taking up the inorganic forms of phosphorus. Phosphorus fertilizer is a source that we have, and it goes into the soil, can go into the soil solution, and then we can also get some of it staying in the soil for a period of time. And depending on what the pH happens to be, there's different sources of phosphorus that probably work better in acid soils as compared to neutral soils as well. So once we get it into the soil solution, a lot of things can happen to that phosphorus. It can be fixed from an iron and aluminum standpoint, maybe even manganese. It can go back to a calcium phosphate, which we call reversion, or so there's several different things that can happen to it, and we really can't account for it very much, and we don't have much control over it. The efficiency for phosphorus is about 25 to 30%. So when at the best. So when we apply 100 pounds of phosphorus, we're probably going to get somewhere between 25 to 30 pounds of that phosphorus actually getting up into the plant. So not near as efficient as what we have for nitrogen, which goes in most of the time anywhere from 60 to 80%. So mineralization has to occur for the organic source of phosphorus to be actually taken up by the plant. So we'll take up most of what we're going to do today is talk about this cycle and the different things that go on within this cycle. Next slide. So some general information slides for the next couple of slides that we'll see. Phosphorus, of course, is a macronutrient along with nitrogen and potassium. It's essential for all plants and animals, and it's part the role that it plays is part of the energy cycle, which is adenosine triphosphate. It also plays a role in DNA and RNA. Its deficiency symptoms are mainly stunted growth, thin stems, spindly appearance, and it also gets some purple spots on dicots, and it gets purpling of the edges of leaves on monocots. Phosphorus in the soil solution is typically going to be somewhere on the order of about 0.3 milligrams per liter. It could be a little bit higher, but that is sufficient to grow most crops. If we look at it from a soil standpoint, usually when we're looking at the soil test results from an extractable standpoint, the phosphorus will usually range somewhere between 30 and 50 parts per million, and it goes up to roughly 100 parts per million in many situations. But in some situations, we can have as much as 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million soil test P. Now, We also have a test, a total phosphorus test, and most of the total phosphorus is going to run anywhere from 500 to 3,000 or 4,000 parts per million. Now, there is absolutely no relationship between total phosphorus and extractable phosphorus. So if you're trying to get a soil test, make for sure that you always specify that they do a soil test extraction, not a total phosphorus, because it has nothing to do with what is going to be available to the plant. And we'll talk about what we use in the state of Texas and what's used in some other states as well to be the extractant for phosphorus here in just a little bit. So this is some examples of phosphorus deficiency on plants. On your left-hand side, this is deficiency of sugarcane, both on the top and the bottom. Notice the spindly growth, not very much vegetation that you see there where you have your phosphorus deficiency. On corn, you get the purpling of the edges of the leaf when the deficiency symptom is kind of marginal. And a lot of times in corn, because we plant it very early, the soil is still fairly cool. And many times this purpling on the edges, when we have marginal amounts of phosphorus available to the plant, will actually, once the soil warms up, that will actually grow out of it. If you've got severe deficiencies like you see on the sugar cane, then it's not going to grow out of that. You're just going to lose crop out of that one. Grapes, you get the purpling spots that you see here, and then the discolored leaves, not green. And then this happens to be a plant that is a high cash crop, but it's not one that we're supposed to be farming. But this is marijuana, in case you haven't seen that before. On a dicot, you'll see the edges, the tips of the plant turning purple and then dying back, as compared to what you see on a monocot with the purpling of the edges on the leaf. Next slide. Forms of phosphorus in the soil. There's two dominant forms. We've got the organic form and we've got the inorganic form. The organic form is going to occupy somewhere on the order of about 65% or a little bit less of the total soil phosphorus. It comes from the organic matter or the organic residues from plants and animals that goes to make up the soil organic matter, which we call humus. It also gets tied up in the microorganisms in phospholipids and nucleic acids. The inorganic form, on the other hand, is going to be makes up about the 35% of the total soil phosphorus. It will mainly be associated with calcium in the more alkaline soils and with iron and aluminum in the more acid soils. And again, the soil solution generally is not going to be more than about 5 parts per million, or it's sufficient for most plant growth if it will be maintained at 0.03 parts per million. The available forms, we've got two available forms to the plant. Both of these are orthophosphates. The first one in acid soils is H2PO4 -1, and that form will dominate in soils less than pH of 7.2. In alkaline soils, the HPO4 -2 will dominate. And again, at pH of 7.2 and higher, that's where that form's going to dominate. So those are the two forms that are taken up by the plant. The other forms of phosphate, inorganic phosphate, will not be taken up by the plant. And the organic forms of phosphorus cannot be taken up by the plant. Next slide. So, what's the mobility of phosphorus in soils? Unlike nitrogen, that wherever the water is going, that's where the nitrogen's going. The phosphorus doesn't move that way. It is very difficult to move phosphorus in soils. And so we've got basically two reactions that occur with phosphorus in soil once the source of phosphorus is applied to the soil, whether it be an organic source or an inorganic source. So if the alkaline soils, it's going to react mainly with calcium and magnesium, Mg. In acid soils, and we back up to the alkaline soils, and we call that a reversion reaction. And the reason we call it a reversion reaction is because most of our phosphorus fertilizers come from rock phosphate, which is a big calcium phosphate molecule. And so once it hits the soils, in the alkaline soils, it reverts back to what it came from, the rock phosphate or the apatite. In the acid soils, it forms an insoluble form with the reaction of aluminum, iron, and to a certain extent manganese, Mn. And we call this a fixation. This is an actual reaction of phosphorus with the iron, aluminum, and manganese, in acid soils. Now, because phosphorus does not move readily in soils, it has a tendency to become stratified in soils. And this is because we don't till our soils near like what we used to, especially from an agriculture standpoint. Around our homes, we may till our flower beds in some areas. We may till our gardens to a certain extent, but we don't till our lawns. And so around our homes, this stratification also occurs if we are applying phosphorus to our soils. And this usually occurs in the top 1 to 3 inches. And we'll talk about how to manage this in a little bit. Next slide. Whoops, too fast. So, if you were trying to manage phosphorus from a pH standpoint, where it has maximum availability is about a pH of 6.5. So, if you're looking at an acid soil and you're trying to grow blueberries in it, and you're at a pH of 5, and you make the decision, well, phosphorus availability is best at 6.5, so I'm going to add agricultural limestone to raise the pH to 6.5. Well, is that a good decision? I hope I hear you saying no, because blueberries do best at pHs between 4.5 and 5.5, so you don't want to raise the pH. Well, what about if you were trying to raise beans or peas? Well, they do best between pHs of 7.5 and 8. I mean, you can grow peas and beans at pHs less than that, but they really and truly do better in our alkaline soils. So does that mean that because phosphorus is more available at 6.5, you're going to try to acidify the soil? Answer again is no. And we normally do not recommend that you try to acidify soils because it's very difficult, and if you add too much of an acidifying material, you can drastically reduce your pH even to pHs of 2.5 to 3, and by that time your plants are dead. So you got a real problem trying to lower the pH. And when we have our 4th session, when we're talking about micronutrients, I'll go into adding agricultural limestone and adding materials to decrease the pH as well, and why we don't recommend those most of the time. Now, we do recommend adding agricultural limestone if it's needed for the particular crop. And for most crops, with the exception of acid-loving plants, we do need to add agricultural limestone every once in a while on acid soils. Next slide. Now, I don't expect you to remember these reactions or anything like that, but what I want you to want to do is show you that this is what's going on in the soil when we have either acid soils or alkaline soils. So again, with acid soils, we're going to get this reaction possibly with iron, aluminum, and maybe manganese, and it is a fixation reaction. So it's an actual reaction with the calcium phosphate or whatever the phosphorus fertilizer is that we're actually adding. So just to give you an example, we can have, in this particular example for the acid soils, we have either iron +3 or aluminum +3 replaces the calcium on the phosphate, and so we form an iron or aluminum phosphate. And the iron and aluminum phosphates are some of the most insoluble forms of phosphorus that we have in soils. And we will actually find these kinds of minerals in our very highly weathered soils that we call oxasols that we see mainly in the rainforests of either South America or Africa, and Australia for that matter. The alkaline soils, on the other hand, the calcium is going to react with the calcium and to a certain extent magnesium. And again, it reverts back to the calcium phosphate from whence it came, which is the apatite. So in this case, we add a phosphorus fertilizer. It reacts more and more with calcium and eventually ends up being the large molecule of hydroxyapatite that's shown here. So anyway, that's just to show you that, and this occurs over a period of time. It doesn't happen immediately when you add the phosphorus fertilizer to the soil. You're going to see this fixation and reversion reactions happen over a period of about 18 to 24 months. But immediately after the phosphorus hits the soil, it starts this process. And so that's one of the primary reasons why we don't have the efficiency of phosphorus being taken up by the plant like we do with nitrogen, because nitrogen doesn't form very many insoluble compounds. Next slide. So if we are looking at the total soil phosphorus content, and we start out with a certain amount of phosphorus, and we start farming this particular site or harvesting something, whatever it may be, from this particular site, we start out with a certain amount of phosphorus. And as time goes, then we start to decrease that amount of phosphorus. And over time, we will get to the point where we have to start applying a particular amount of inorganic or organic phosphorus to build that phosphorus back up so that we can actually continue to grow plants. Now, we have some soils in Texas that have quite a bit of phosphorus in them, and this is typically going to be more the alkaline soils that we have in Texas. So in some of those situations, we don't have to apply very much phosphorus, but in other situations, we may need to apply fairly large quantities of phosphorus. Next slide. So what are our phosphorus sources? These are going to be from a very broad category. This is going to be the apatite, or what we call the rock phosphate. And again, this can be the hydroxy, the fluoro, or the chloral forms of that mineral. Plant residue has somewhere on the order of 0.2 to 0.4% phosphorus. Animal residue is about the same, about 0.5 to 4% phosphorus. The desorption that comes from the iron and aluminum oxides and hydroxides, and we do get a little bit of desorption from some of our silicate clays as well. Fertilizers, our inorganic fertilizers, are made mainly from the rock phosphate. We react the rock phosphate with sulfuric acid or phosphoric acid, and then that produces a phosphoric acid, and we make the additional phosphorus fertilizers. One thing that we end up with, when we, at least from the phosphorus fertilizers that we make here in the United States, is a byproduct gypsum. Gypsum is calcium sulfate with 2 waters attached to it. But all the rock phosphate that we mine in the United States has a certain amount of radioactive material associated with it. One of those is uranium, and the other one is radon. Both of these have a fairly long half-life, as you can see in parentheses. Well, what the phosphorus industry is now doing is they're doing a very good job of scrubbing out the radioactive materials that were associated with the gypsum, byproduct gypsum at one time. However, because there is radioactivity associated with it, this cannot be land applied. About 15 years ago, this was applied as a source of calcium and sulfur, especially in peanuts. There was some outcry that this particular gypsum could end up in wallboard and therefore be very detrimental to human lives. Well, the amount of radioactivity that's actually found in this material before they started scrubbing it out was what you would have in most of the bricks that we have around our buildings. So some people have bricks inside their house, and they have a certain amount of radioactivity that's going to be coming from that. And so it wasn't very much, but because of the public outcry, EPA made the decision that no gypsum could be land applied, therefore eliminating it from ever being used as wallboard, even though it wasn't being used as wallboard. So I'll show you a picture in Florida here in just a little bit that shows what's happening to the gypsum today. Well, this is the phosphorus distribution that we have across the world. The United States has about 7.8%. South Africa about 9.7%, Jordan about 5.8%, and Morocco and China control over 50% of all of the phosphorus that's still easily mineable. And that's the key. So that's the easily mineable part. Most of what we mine in the United States comes out of North Carolina and Florida. And we'd also have a little bit in Alaska as well. What the United States has done, thank goodness, is they made a bilateral free trade agreement with Morocco in 2004, and this allows U.S. long-term access to the Moroccan phosphate. China has about 135 export tariff on it, and that's not something that we would like to be paying. So as long as political issues are okay with Morocco, this will be a good thing. If something ever happens with Morocco, then the United States is going to be in dire need of some phosphorus. We have approximately, let me see what my next slide is. Oh, okay. We have approximately 30, somewhere on the order of 25 years of easily mineable phosphorus left in the United States. If you look at all of the easily mineable phosphorus across the world, including China and Morocco, there's somewhere on the order of approximately 75 to 100 years of easily mineable phosphate. So we're talking about our great-grandchildren, if you're my age, which I'm 60, that is going to have a dire need for phosphorus if they're still farmers or ranchers trying to grow crops. So one thing that will probably happen over time is that we will start reverting back to a lot more use of manures, because manures contain quite a bit of phosphorus within them. So not to be alarming or anything, but phosphorus is something that we're going to have to really start conserving and reduce the amount of phosphorus that we're putting on soils so that we have enough to stretch out for years to come. I told you that in the United States that gypsum can no longer be land applied. So if you're driving in Florida almost anywhere and you see a hill that's either green or white, more than likely that's a gypsum stack. And the gypsum stacks that's white has not been covered. The gypsum stacks that are green have been covered with topsoil to a depth of about 2 feet, and now they are growing grass on top of those stacks. So we've got a resource there that could be land applied, but unfortunately, because of some regulations, we can't apply that anymore. So what are some phosphorus losses that we have? Well, one is crop removal or uptake, and that's exactly the one that we want. Again, erosion is phosphorus is much more susceptible to erosion than it is runoff, and the primary reason is because it adheres to the soil particles and is not very soluble within the soil solution. So because of that, we have minimal leaching losses, except where the soil is very sandy or where we have added a tremendous amount of organic phosphorus over a period of time. And so basically what's happened in that situation is we have saturated those calcium, magnesium, iron, aluminum, and manganese sites, and so that reversion and fixation is no longer occurring. And so the organic phosphorus compounds are much more mobile, and we start to move those down into the soil profile. Another loss is with iron and aluminum and with fixation, and then the reversion back with the appetite to the calcium-rich soils. Immobilization, so we can actually immobilize the phosphorus again, and if we're seeing that immobilization, then we actually take that phosphorus that was in the inorganic form, and the microorganisms use it to start the breakdown of organic materials, and so they convert it back to the organic form of phosphorus. Again, the immobilization is a short decrease in the amount of phosphorus that's available to the plant. Eventually what will happen is that the carbon to phosphorus ratio will be low enough that we won't see that immobilization any longer, and we'll start seeing mineralization of the organic phosphorus back to the inorganic form. Absorption of iron and, on iron and aluminum hydrous oxides and silicate clays occurs, and then we actually get some phosphorus in a process we call occluded. Well, what's occluded? Well, occluded means that it's buried. Now, go back to adsorption. This adsorption, it's not absorption, A-D, not A-B. The adsorption means that it's absorbed on the outside of the iron, aluminum, hydrous oxides, and the silicate clays. It's not part of the structure of those compounds. Now, occluded, again, means buried. So how do we get phosphorus buried? Well, this usually occurs in our calcareous soils, where the calcium phosphates that we apply, or the organic phosphates that we apply, react with the calcium phosphates, or excuse me, calcium that's in the alkaline soils. It also reacts with the calcium carbonate. The calcium carbonate will dissolve, precipitate, and as we get wetting and drying cycles. And so what happens is that the calcium phosphate will adhere to the calcium carbonate. We get a little of that dissolving and precipitation, and then all of a sudden the calcium phosphate, which doesn't dissolve and precipitate very well, actually gets buried within the calcium carbonate. So that is what we call occluded. So there's a difference between fixation that goes with iron and aluminum and possibly manganese. Reversion is mainly calcium and, to a lesser extent, magnesium. The adsorption goes with the iron, aluminum oxides and hydroxides and silicate clays, and the occluded goes mainly with calcium carbonate. So the type and amount of clay that plays a role is it's mainly 2 to 1 layer. Rate and extent of the reversion increases with the clay content, and it's mainly a surface area, and it's also cation exchange capacity, but on the other side of that, it's also an anion exchange if we get to pHs less than 5.5. The reversion reaction is going to be mainly pHs greater than 7, where we start to see the solubility of phosphorus decrease. So again, the solubility of phosphorus is greatest somewhere between a pH of 6 and 7, and its optimum pH is about 6.5. Time and contact, again, increasing time of the reaction increases the potential for the fixation and the reversion. And again, we're talking typically, we're not going to see this occurring too much until you get out into the 18 months, maybe to 24 months. So phosphorus is pretty soluble for a period of time, but still the ability to, its efficiency to be taken up into the plant is not very good, somewhere again between 20 and 30%. Okay, phosphorus characteristic reactions. Main problem with phosphorus in most soils is that it's not too plant available, and it's pH dependent. You remember I told you that the difference between an acid soil and an alkaline soil was at pH of 7.2 as far as the availability of a particular type of phosphorus. So the H2PO4 minus is going to be dominant at pH of 7.2 and less, and the HPO4 minus 2 is going to be dominant at pH of 7.2 and greater. They are equal in concentration at pH of 7.2. So this is just a titration curve for phosphoric acid. And so what you see, the phosphoric acid disappears by pH of 4. Then we start to see the H2PO4 that actually comes in, starts to play a role, and starts to dominate at pHs of 2, and dominates until we see a pH of 7.2. The HPO4 minus 2 starts to come in about 5.8, dominates at 7.2 all the way to about 12.2, 12.3. So that's the reason that the two forms that we see that are plant available are solely going to be the H2PO4 minus 1 and the HPO4 minus 2. Those are the ones that dominate in the areas where we actually can grow plants. Acid soils, again, H2PO4 reacts with the iron and aluminum, and the HPO4 minus 2 reacts mainly with the calcium and possibly with magnesium. This kind of shows you again a area where we're looking at fixation and reversion. And so we have our greatest fixation with phosphorus by iron, starting at a pH of about 3 and going to a pH of about 6. Our greatest fixation with aluminum starts at about a pH of 3.5, goes all the way to a pH of about almost pH 7. This is where pH between 6 and 7 is where we have very little fixation or reversion occurring. So this is, again, the primary reason why that's the optimum pH for availability of phosphorus. So at a pH of about 6.5, we start to see reversion of the phosphorus occurring with calcium and magnesium. So just a couple of different ways of showing you how phosphorus is available, mainly at a pH of 6.5, but its optimum availability is 6 to 7. So the soil pH. Some factors that affect phosphorus solubility and pH and availability. We've talked about the soil pH, organic matter content, and mineralization rate. So if we have a good organic matter content and we are have good carbon to nitrogen ratios especially, then we're going to have a net mineralization. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio would be 20 to 1, where we would have that net mineralization, and that will also be, we'll have a net mineralization for phosphorus at that point. The sources of phosphorus are organic versus inorganic. The organic sources of phosphorus, very similar to the organic sources of nitrogen. They have to go through a mineralization process, and that takes anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. So if you are using organic sources of phosphorus, you want to make for sure that you get your organic source out 2 to 4 weeks before the plant really starts to need that phosphorus. Whereas with an inorganic source, and this is just an example of one, O13O, it's a calcium phosphate, then you put that out and you should see a response within 1 or 2 days. Mineral sources of phosphorus, particle size makes a big difference as far as its solubility, so our availability. So particle size, we want a particle size that's fairly small, and the smaller you can get it, the better off you're going to be. And the solubility of whatever material that you're applying needs to be fairly soluble. So particle size plays a big role in its availability as well as solubility does. The amount of calcium, iron, aluminum, magnesium, manganese affect availability because it reacts with the phosphorus, and again, the smaller the particle size of those, the more reactive those materials are going to be. Soil temperature and moisture play a role in mineralization, and it also plays a role from the solubility of the phosphorus. Remember the corn plant that I showed you to begin with had purpling on the edges of the leaf, and many times, like I said, even if you have marginal amounts of phosphorus in your soil, that purpling will go away once the soil warms up. If the purpling does not go away, then you're going to see some yield decreases just because you don't have enough phosphorus for that plant to grow and reproduce. So need the phosphorus out there. Soil test, we always recommend that you do a soil test. The plant tissue analysis can help a little bit, but tissue analysis without a soil test analysis doesn't help you a whole lot. So always make for sure you take a look at your soil test. So how does moisture affect it? Well, moisture affects mineralization. If we don't have a good if we don't have good moisture, we're not going to have good mineralization. So moisture plays a big part in that. So we want to have moist soils as for the majority of the time, and again, makes a difference from a standpoint of growing a plant as well. Now, I know we haven't talked about any of these things that are listed here, the andesol, oxisol, eptisol, mollisol, vertisol, and histosol. That's probably Greek to you. But that's okay, because I'm going to tell you what they are. Well, this graph is phosphorus added to the soil in milligram per kilogram versus the phosphorus in the soil solution in milligram per liter. And that's on a log scale. Okay, so what's an andesol? What are these sols that I got put up here? These are our orders of soils that we have. We have a classification system very similar to plants and animals. And we have 12 soil orders, and it goes from order to suborder to great group and on down the line until it gets, instead of a species, it actually gets, we go to a soil series. So this is the highest classification, highest part of the classification system of soils. So what are these individual orders? Well, the andesol is a soil that's derived from volcanic materials. So any place where you've got a volcanic activity or had volcanic activity at some time, those are going to be andesols. Oxisols, these are the most highly weathered soils that we have in the world, and we're going to find those in the rainforest, in the tropical rainforest. So we have some of these in Hawaii, we have some in South America, mainly in Brazil, and then we have some in Africa, and we also have some in the northern part of Australia. For the most part. So those are our oxisols, the most highly weathered soils that we have. Ultisols are second from a weathering standpoint. So they're almost to the point where we're going into an oxisol, but not quite. We have ultisols in the state of Texas. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So the ultisols are highly weathered soils, but they're not going to be in the rainforest. They would be in the areas where we get have a fairly warm temperature and a high amount of precipitation. The mollisols, these are the most highly productive soils that we have in the world, and we're fortunate that through the center part of the United States, most of those soils through that area are mollisols, and those are the most productive soils in the world, actually. These are soils that were developed in areas where we had short and tall grass prairie from a natural vegetation. So we've got very deep A horizons that have a lot of organic matter in them. So very, very productive soils. The vertisols, if you know what a vertisol is, if you've actually seen these things very easily. These are the ones that shrink and swell in soil. Whenever we get a little bit of deficit as far as moisture is concerned, you get cracks in the soil. And so if you live in some of these areas, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't, consider yourself blessed. The histosols, these are the organic soils. These are the ones that have little to no mineral component. They are dominated by organic matter. Most of you have probably seen the commercials with the cranberry juice, where the guys are standing out in hip waders in an area. Well, those are actually histosols that happen to be flooded. So, do we have any of these particular soils in Texas? Well, we have andesols in Texas. We've got an area from a little bit south of San Antonio all the way over to the Big Bend area where we've had some volcanic activity over time. And so we have some andesols in that area. We do not have any oxisols in Texas. The only oxisols we have in the United States are going to be in Hawaii. We have some ultisols in Texas. Pretty much approximately 54 counties in East Texas are going to be where our ultisols are going to dominate, and these are where most of the pine, where you see from a natural vegetation or even a planted vegetation, most of the piney woods that we have in Texas. The mollisols make up the center part of the state of Texas. About 35 to roughly 35% of all the soils in the state of Texas are mollisols. Highly productive soils. So these are the ones that are going to have again a very deep A horizon, lots of organic matter in that horizon. Has to be at least 12 inches of organic matter, or excuse me, 12 inches of dark colored soil on the surface to make a mollisol. The vertisols, yeah, we got vertisols in the state of Texas. We've got a line of vertisols that runs from Dallas down to about Corpus Christi, and then we've got another line of vertisols that kind of hugs the coast of Texas. And again, like I said, if you live on these kind of soils, you already know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, you're in good shape. Histosols, yeah, we got some histosols along the coast, but that's about it. So, from a standpoint of phosphorus absorption to these things, the more what we call amorphous material or non-crystalline material that are there, and the more iron and aluminum oxides that we have in that material, the more that particular soil order will fix phosphorus. So the andesols have a lot of amorphous material in them, and so they have the ability to fix tremendous amounts of phosphorus before we'll actually start seeing very much phosphorus in soil solution. The oxisols are next, the ultisols are next, and then the mollisols. And the mollisols are more because of the organic matter and that's tied up with the soil. So that kind of gives you an idea of what those happen to be. And again, if you're in those areas, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We want to try to maintain the pH between 6 and 7 if we can, but if you have an acid-loving plant, don't raise the pH to 6 because you're probably going to cause some problems. We want to maintain the organic matter as high as we can, but from the standpoint of adding organic materials to your soils, always watch the nutrient content. Make for sure that you really watch the nutrient content on the organic materials that you're applying to the soils, because you can way over apply phosphorus with organics if you're not paying attention to what you're actually applying. This makes for good microbial activity, especially during the growing season. And around in most of the state of Texas, we got a growing season, with the exception of where we get ice and snow. We can actually grow even a pretty good winter garden a lot of times. Perhaps about a third of the phosphorus applied is actually used on a yearly basis. The next year we'll have some residual phosphorus that may be available to the plant, but you know we can't always guarantee that, and because of that fixation possibility of the different minerals that I talked about and the different soil orders that I talked about. And again, the stratification issue. We've got to have a different way of sampling if we've got this potential stratification issue, and we'll talk about that. So, what can where would we normally have fairly high phosphorus contents from a soil standpoint? This happens to be a soil that same soil series, but has been managed 3 different ways. So we've got the different soil horizons. We've got an A horizon. An A horizon, again, is going to be the surface soil that we always have, and that's going to be where most of the organic matter is. The E horizon is a bleached horizon, and so it's going to be much lighter in color. It'll have much less clay and a lot more sand than even the A horizon does. The BH, the V stands for having an accumulation of something, and in this particular case it's an accumulation of humic materials. That's what the H stands for. And so we've got an accumulation of humic material there. And then we have another B horizon that is BW, and I apologize, I can't remember what the W stands for. I'll let you know what that is next week. I apologize for not remembering that. So we've got three different management systems for the same soil series. So we take a look at the native areas where virtually native vegetation is being grown. We have very little phosphorus in that situation. Where we've been maintaining it for pastures, and from a pasture standpoint, this can be either grazing or hay. And so we are typically adding some nutrients in that situation to either maintain the hay or maintain the grazing. Well, look what intensive dairy areas does. We've gone from less than probably 250 parts per million that we have even in a pasture situation. This is total, so it's not extractable. So this is total phosphorus. In the intensive dairy area in the A horizon, we've gone over 3,000 parts per million, or milligram per kilogram. So the addition of organic sources of nutrients to meet the nutrient needs of the crop can overapply phosphorus, especially if we're trying to apply it to meet the nitrogen needs of the crop. This is a soil in Nebraska. This happens to be a mollisol. We're looking at again the soil depth on the left-hand side, and we're looking at the available phosphorus. So that we're looking at extractable phosphorus in this particular case that would be available to the plant. So again, we've got the same soil series, This is 42 years of adding phosphorus to a soil, and what they're asking you to do is take a look at the mobility of the phosphorus, especially from an organic standpoint. So no treatment at all. We've got the solid line, very little phosphorus in the soil from the surface all the way down. We look at a phosphorus where we've applied nitrogen and phosphorus at 80 pounds of P. We are about 75 milligrams per kilogram at the surface, at a little bit about 0.2 meters. We still got about 50, and it changes a little bit as you go down, and then we've got to get down to about 0.75 meters before we really start to drop off. So we've had some downward movement of phosphorus, even in the all the way down to right at 1 meter, where we've applied inorganic phosphorus over a 42-year period. But where we've applied inorganic phosphorus and organic source of manure, an organic source of phosphorus, we've got about twice as much phosphorus in the A horizon, about 25% more at 0.2 and about 0.5 meters. We've got quite a bit downward movement at 1 meter, and even all the way down to almost a meter, a little over 1.5 meters, we've got downward movement. And again, it's mainly because of the organic source of phosphorus. So the organic source of phosphorus is typically going to be more mobile, and so if you're using organics, be cautious of applying. Make for sure you got a good idea of what the nutrient sources is in that particular material. So you need to know what the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but especially the nitrogen and phosphorus in that material. Addition, what we try to get people to do is to put the phosphorus out at what we call agronomic rates. Well, that agronomic rate is based on the crop and the yield gold, and it's based on a soil test, and a soil test based that has been calibrated to conditions that you have in your particular area. Excuse me. So this may need to be applied on a yearly basis, but it may only need to be applied every other year. It just depends on what's going on. Banding, the source of nutrients, can actually reduce that potential for reversion and fixation, or string it out for a longer period of time. So what is banding? Well, banding is is actually dropping or injecting fertilizer below or to the side of the seed when you're planting. Some people have also put it with the seed. We normally don't recommend that you put very much with the seed. It's more, you can put all the nutrient down that you need if you're banding it or injecting it, if you put it to the side of the seed or below the seed. If you're putting it with the seed, you always want to make for sure that you're looking at the amount of nitrogen and or potassium that you're putting out, and you don't want to put out more than about 10 pounds of a combination of nitrogen and potassium. The phosphorus fertilizers are not quite as salty, and so we don't have quite as much issue with the phosphorus fertilizers as we do with the nitrogen and the potassium. And so what it does is it actually salts out your seeds, so you kill the germination. Usually we see phosphorus deficiencies, we can see them early in the spring, and again it may grow out of it just because of temperature. But again, this is usually when we have we're starting to get some marginal amounts of phosphorus available to the plant. So you may need to think about actually adding some phosphorus to the soil. Those P deficiency symptoms again are purpling of the leaf, the general stunting, and then spindly growth. Now, soil test extractions. These need to be based on tests that have been done on soils from your region, from your environment, and again, it's correlated to the plant uptake and yield. There's several different methods that are used across the United States, and these are the typical ones that we see across most of the United States. In the acid soils, we see Bray 1, Bray 2, Malic 1, and Malic 3. In the alkaline soils, we see a few, and this is used in soil testing laboratories for universities and for commercial laboratories, by the way. In alkaline soils, one that is normally used is Olson. and what we found is that we can use the Malic 3 both in the acid and the alkaline situations. It was developed for acid soils, but we found that it works very, very well in alkaline soils as well. Malic 3 is what we recommend in the state of Texas, and that's what we use in Texas at our Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Soil, Water, and Forage Testing Laboratory that we have here on the A&M campus. If you're working with with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, with a nutrient management plan, or if you're working with any of the concentrated animal feeding operations, that is the required test, or the required extractant for phosphorus. Now, Malic 3 is also a multi-element extraction, and so with Texas A&M we use it to extract phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sodium, and sulfur. There are some states that also use it to extract iron, manganese, zinc, and copper. We haven't found any correlation with our Texas soils for iron, manganese, zinc, and copper, so we don't use it for that. But we do use it for what we call our routine analysis. And if you call us and ask us to take a look at another laboratory soil test analysis, we greatly would appreciate it if you would have that other soil test laboratory do the Malic 3, because we don't have any way of correlating Malic 3 to any of the other soil test extractants. So I highly suggest that you use the Malic 3, because we've got a lot of data to back up our recommendations for that. So when you put fertilizer out, what happens to it? If we put out, what we try to do, and this gives you an example of how we do this, determine the soil test recommendations. So we look at the dry matter yield, and what we want to happen is that the curve that you see here, we actually want it to curve over, because at this breaking point right here is where our soil test recommendation should be for that yield goal that we're trying to reach. So this happens to be for coastal Bermuda grass that was where phosphorus was applied on a Lilbert loamy fine sand to begin with, tested very, very low in phosphorus, and this is at Overton. And so again, what we would then recommend for somewhere around 7 tons per acre of dry matter would be about 140 pounds of P2O5. So this phosphorus stratification, why does it come about? Well, it comes about mainly because phosphorus is so immobile once it hits the soil. So it usually happens in the top 1 to 3 inches. It's due because of surface fertilization, and it doesn't make any difference whether we're using an organic source or an inorganic source of nutrients, with little or no incorporation. So from a soil testing standpoint, this kind of gives us some fits, because well, I'll show you a slide here in just a little bit. So the reduced tillage or limited soil mixing really plays a lot of role in this stratification. If we have people that still till every once in a while, we don't necessarily recommend that they do conventional tillage anymore, but we do recommend that if you're using no-till, that approximately every 4 to 5 years that you go out and actually till the soil 3 to 6 inches deep. And this does a couple of things. Number one, it mixes nutrients such as phosphorus within the soil. The second thing that it does is many times with no-till land, we actually start to get some compaction, and with that compaction, by tilling the soil a little bit, then you actually break that compaction. So crop uptake of those nutrients and surface deposition of the residues plays another role. So all that serves to keep the nutrient, especially phosphorus, right at the surface. Next slide. This is an example in Falls County, and looking at soil test phosphorus at 0 to 2, 2 to 6, and 6 to 12 inches. You'll notice that these 3 locations, tremendous amount of phosphorus in the top 2 inches. We've got a little bit, quite a bit in the 2 to 6 inch layer on sites B and C, but look what happens whenever you get to 6 to 12 inches. It really starts to drop off. So we really have and once you get to 10 parts per million, you really have some issues from the standpoint of being able to grow a crop. If you're less than 20 or 30, sometimes it takes us quite a bit of nutrient, quite a bit of phosphorus to build that soil back up to above 20 or 30 parts per million. And again, it depends on the reversion and the fixation capability of that soil from the iron, aluminum, and calcium. So this is an example of what actually gives us fits from a standpoint of soil testing. We make a recommendation that you go out and take and collect a 0 to 6 inch sample. And so you go out and take a 0 to 6 inch sample from this particular site. We got 150 parts per million in the 0 to 2, 25 parts per million in the 2 to 4, and 5 parts per million in the 4 to 6, and 5 to 3 parts per million from there on down. So you take a 0 to 6 inch sample and you end up with 60 parts per million. Well, we don't make recommendations if you're above 50 parts per million for most crops. So your recommendation would come back 0 for phosphorus. Well, if we knocked the top inch off of this particular site and took 1 to 7 inches, then we got an 8.8 part per million. Or if we take a 3 inch soil test, we're going to have about an 8 part per, we're going to have about a 5 part per million soil test phosphorus. So it is really deficient whenever you get below that 4 inch level. Well, does that make a difference? It can, and it can make a big difference. Let me show you why. Let me show you the next slide. Okay, now you got to pretend that you're a plant. And in pretending that you're a plant, when we have a very wet surface, and we got roots growing up here at the surface, no big deal. We got plenty of phosphorus right there in the surface. At the 3 to 9 inch level, we're only 20 parts per million. At 9 to 12, we're 9 parts per million. So if we got a very wet surface, we got lots of roots growing up here real close to the surface. So we don't get deficiency symptoms. But if we've got a dry surface and we've got roots going down into the soil looking for moisture, then we're starting to grow in some of these deficient areas as far as soil phosphorus is concerned. And so this is where we actually start to see our deficiency symptoms popping up. So around our home, most of the time we're going to keep the moisture contents up fairly high. And so stratification usually doesn't give us very much of a problem around our homes. But out in the field, it can give us all kinds of fits because our roots are growing deeper, searching for water, and we're growing in those very deficient areas. So tillage makes a big difference if we can mix this soil. So what are our recommendations? If you expect that you have some stratification with phosphorus, again, you've got the soil test, but let me back up just a little bit. The frequency of soil testing, we recommend that you do it at least every 3 years. It would be better if you did it every year, but at least every 3 years, unless you're changing something around your home. Now, if you're in an agriculture situation, we want you soil testing on a yearly basis. At the cost of fertilizer or cost of nutrients today, whether it's an organic source or an inorganic source, it pays you to get a 40-acre sample, a representative sample, and pay $10 to see how much nutrients you really need. So $10 investment could save you hundreds of dollars from a standpoint of fertilizer. So it's a good investment in your nutrients. Plus, if you don't need the phosphorus and you're putting it out, it saves phosphorus for our great grandkids and great grandkids. So what we recommend, if you expect that you got this stratification, is that you take a 0 to 3 and a 3 to 9 inch sample about every 5 years. Well, why do we want you to do that? Well, if you're not tilling, then that's about the time that it would be recommended that you would be doing your tillage practice anyway. So this gives you, you still do your routine analysis on those, and that gives you that'll give you an indication of whether you've got that stratification or not. If you've got stratification, you've got to get the phosphorus into the soil some way. And there's two ways that you can do that. We can do that through deep tillage, or we can do it through subsurface banding. And I'll give you some examples of that. Just so, what happens to phosphorus in the plant? Well, it's readily available, readily translocated in the plant. So it is very mobile in the plant. So wherever the plant needs that nutrient, it can be translocated. So typically, if we're going to see a deficiency in phosphorus, we're going to see it on the older leaves first, not the younger leaves. Next. Functions, again, transfer of energy, main thing, stimulates root growth and root formation. This is critical in the spring, especially for crops that are perennial crops. So we want to make for sure. Used to, we only thought that winter kill would come because of potassium, not having enough starches stored in the roots. But what we found is that many times when we're phosphorus deficient, we're also seeing a lot of winter kill. So make for sure you've got good concentrations of phosphorus, especially in the fall, right before that crop goes dormant, because you're going to need that. You're going to need it for the spring green up. So again, that purpling leaf on a corn plant, and again, sometimes it's going to grow out of it, but not all the time. This is another example. You've got good phosphorus concentrations on these two plants, stunted growth, purpling of the leaves. And so look at the roots. Look at the difference in the roots. Spindly roots, very few roots, large roots, and so the ability of that plant to take nutrients up and water is drastically reduced as compared to these nice looking fibrous roots and lots of little tiny roots that you have on the normal plant. So if you were trying to produce corn and you had crop growing looking like this, do you think you're going to grow very much corn? Answer to that's probably not. This gives you another indication. This is some grain sorghum. This had phosphorus applied to it. This was a strip where it was left out. Look at the heads on this area where the phosphorus is deficient. Very small heads, whether to produce a seed, it may or may not even produce a seed in that particular head. But look at the difference in the growth of the plant and the maturity. So this is getting very close to being ready to harvest. This is way, way behind if it ever gets to the point where you could harvest anything off of it. So phosphorus does play a major role in maturing the crop, stunted growth, and root development and elongation. So like the nitrogen, we have this rule of thumb that we say for a particular crop, it takes about that many pounds of P2O5. So for corn per bushel, about 0.5. For cotton, for 100 pounds, 0.8. Grains, for grain sorghum, for 100 weight, about 1 pound per thousand, for 100 weight. For wheat per bushel, about 1. And for warm season grasses per ton, about 14 pounds of P2O5. So you don't need to go take a soil test. All you need to do is just apply that much, right? No. You don't have any idea how much is actually in your soil that's available to the plant. So again, we always recommend that you do a soil test, and again, around our homes, about every 3 years, unless you change something. If you take an area that's been yard grass and you till it up and make a flower bed or a garden out of it, you need to take another soil test, because you're going to treat your flower bed, your garden, your lawn, you treat them all differently. You don't put out the same amount of nutrients on each one of those areas. So always make for sure that however you're treating your soil from a nutrient standpoint, that those are areas that you sample differently. So these are some sources of nutrients for phosphorus. I'm not going to read those off. You can see them, and you can see what the analysis happened to be. So we've got some different materials that work a little bit better in alkaline soils as compared to acid soils. So the diammonium phosphate works a little bit better in alkaline pH. The monoammonium phosphate works a little bit better in acid pHs. So and why would that be? Well, let's go back and think about what these two phosphorus orthophosphate forms are. The one that is more soluble in alkaline soils is the HPO4 -1. excuse me, -2. And the one that's more soluble in the acid soils is H2PO4 -1. So it makes sense that that particular form of phosphorus would be better in those situations. Now, the calcium phosphates, well, let me back up. The ammoniated phosphates have both a source of nitrogen and for phosphorus. The calcium phosphates, there's lots of different calcium phosphates. Used to, we saw triple superphosphate, ordinary superphosphate, superphosphate, and they go anywhere from 020 to 046O. You don't see those near as much as you used to as far as a source of nutrients from a fertilizer dealer. We see more of the ammonium phosphate and diammonium phosphate than others, and the ammonium polyphosphate liquid fertilizer as well. But we don't see those calcium phosphates near as much. A lot of it's going into animal feed, but like I said, when you go to the fertilizer store, you just don't see those near as much as what we used to. The rock phosphate, again, it works fairly well in acid soils. It has a very low solubility, and if you're using it from an organic source, and it is it will meet the certification for organically grown. But you want to make for sure that you're not using it on pHs, well, really and truly 5.5 and greater, because you just won't get much of a response because of its low solubility. I give you, for instance, the rock phosphate is the enamel on your teeth. And so you can get an idea of its solubility even under, acid conditions. If you're like my kids and my wife that like to eat lemons, over a period of time, you can tell that, that rock phosphate does dissolve. But that's a lifetime, and we're trying to grow crops, so it's not real solid. So let's look at some management considerations for phosphorus. First of all, if we can, and again, this is both, from your garden, flower beds, and also from an agriculture standpoint. We really want to put it out either right at planting if we can, or right before planting. And you want to put out all of your phosphorus at the same time you put out your initial amount of nitrogen. So we're going to spoon feed the nitrogen with anywhere from 2 to 4 applications through the growing season, if we can. If you're applying an organic source, you put it all out in somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks before the plant actually needs it. From an inorganic standpoint, we would put all of the phosphorus fertilizer out at the initial time whenever we're putting out the first nitrogen application. And again, it's mainly because it carries through the growing season. It's not luxury consumed. It doesn't leach, so it stays pretty well where you put it. So pre-plant applications near the time of seeding or green up if you've got a perennial crop. We can use it as a pop-up fertilizer with the seed or right below it. The one thing that you want to make for sure, if you're using diammonium phosphate as a pop-up fertilizer, make for sure that you do not put it with the seed, because it produces free ammonia with calcareous soils, and so that'll pretty well kill your seed. So make for sure that you put it to the side of the seed, not with the seed in that case. You want to manage the nitrogen rate in this case as well, so that you don't prevent any kind of salt injury. So again, make for sure that you don't put more than 10 pounds of nitrogen with the seed, even if it is applied as diammonium phosphate. Side dress early is critical. So if you were not able to get it on pre-plant or at planting, again, put all of it that you're going to need through the growing season there from a side dress standpoint. And again, make for sure that you don't do any pruning of roots. So you've got a pretty narrow window when you can actually side dress with either nitrogen or phosphorus. There's been some indication, especially from some of the lack of a better term, fertilizer dealers, that says that there's some time that's required for this to be activated so it's available to the plant. Wrong. Once it hits the ground, it's available to the plant. So don't worry about activation of phosphorus compounds to the soil. Fall application, it can work, but again, you've got to compensate for that fixation and reversion reactions. You do have, if it's not incorporated, you do have the potential for erosion losses. And if it ends up in our surface water bodies, we've got some potential issues. Next slide. This slide looks a whole lot like the one I showed you for nitrogen, but it's actually for phosphorus. And so again, somewhere between that 20 to 25 days is when the nutrient is really needed. So if we could, we would want to put this out at about 15 days. Well, that works hunky-dory around our houses and things like that. For a garden or a flower bed, but from an agriculture standpoint, if it rained right here and the next time you can get out is somewhere around 30 to 35 days, you've missed some yield potential. So getting it out at planting or right before planting is probably the best time to actually put it out. Next slide. Surface broadcast, incorporated improves that positional availability, and it reduces the potential for erosion. And again, solubility of the materials, we may get some runoff, but usually the dominant loss that we have is going to be because of erosion. Band it or inject it, and this really improves that positional availability, and we reduce the potential for any kind of runoff and erosion losses. Infer with the seed, again, avoid that nitrogen rate of 10 pounds or more, and that's mainly because of salt injury that we have. Foliar application doesn't work. The plant really does not have the ability to take up phosphorus through the leaf. Make for sure you get it on the soil. That's where it works best. Next slide. So get it incorporated or get it injected makes a big difference in what we actually see. Next slide. This gives you an idea of what placement does for us. This is pounds per acre of sorghum, where we've got phosphorus applied. We put no phosphorus out. We surface applied it, did not incorporate, put 30 pounds per acre 6 inches down, and we put 60 pounds 6 inches down. So what happens? Well, we get a yield response a little bit when we put it on the surface over a 3-year period, but look what happens whenever we put it down 30 inches deep. The same amount, about 6 inches deep. We almost always get a much better response. We put the 60 pounds out, we get a little response from that, but typically what happens, next slide, is that you can actually reduce the amount of phosphorus that you're putting out if you actually band it. This shows that phosphorus solubility. We're looking at a loam out here at about 1.5 inches. If we're looking at a clay, we're looking at about less than an inch that phosphorus pellet or granule actually dissolves and diffuses out. So we just don't get very much movement of phosphorus in soils. Next slide. So this is an example of banding or injection. We've got the seed planted here, and we've got the fertilizer applied to the side about 6 inches, about 2 inches down and about 6 inches to the side. And so the seed germinates without any issues, grows into the fertilizer area, and we get maximum absorption of that nutrient. Next slide. So reasons to ban: medium and high soil test P. Again, that's stratification. Limited potential for you to incorporate. Dry surface conditions are expected. And that's Texas. So it really does usually pay for us to get it down into the soil. And the other thing is, especially with the cost of fertilizer that we're seeing now, you got a potential to reduce the fertilizer rates 25 to 40% because it is positionally available to the plant, and that makes a big difference with phosphorus. Next slide. So in perennial pastures, a good time when you're managing your pastures to renovate them, this is also a good time to inject those phosphorus fertilizers. So by injecting whenever you're putting the when you're doing the renovation, or if you do the renovation and then come back in on top of this and put the fertilizer down, when you get that first precipitation, then the nutrients that were on the surface will go down into those cracks, and you get some downward movement. So good thing to do. Next slide. You want to base your rates again on your crop yield goals, and make for sure that this is realistic. Say for instance you're growing well, cotton, for lack of a better term, and your yield goal has been 3 bales per acre, and you've never produced more than 2 bales per acre. It's just not going to happen. So make for sure that you got realistic yield goals, and then apply the phosphorus as close to planting as you possibly can, because that improves your uptake efficiency. Next slide. Periodic evaluation of the stratification, again, about every 4 or 5 years should be adequate. And then if you do have the stratification, if you can either till it or incorporate it or get it banded, one of the two. Next slide. Low salt, reasons to broadcast. If you've got a real low soil test phosphorus, this gives you a good broad application, but you don't have any stratification potential issues there, at least to begin with. And you need good surface moisture, either from an irrigation or rainfall standpoint. Next slide. So this was taken a long time ago, but they did a survey of Texas to see how much phosphorus we actually had across the state of Texas. And so the very red colors, these right here, are very low. The medium is the brown, the blue is high, and this yellow color, which we don't have any yellow color in Texas, would be very high. So across the state of Texas, we're dominated by low to moderate as far as the amount of phosphorus that we have available to the plant. So I think that's it.